It was supposed to be just another day, just another regular trip into Jerusalem. The warm wind, the dust from the feet of the pilgrims headed to the holy city, the murmur of the crowd, a little louder than normal this year. The day was young. The activities and the tasks of the day were just beginning to unfold, when out of the city came the parade of common criminals. It is a sight often seen outside the walls of Jerusalem. Criminals who have been sentenced to die by crucifixion, paraded through the streets as a warning to anyone who'd ever think of going against Rome. And these criminals are forced to carry their own devices of death. It is a weighty reminder of their sins, where then they would be nailed to those crosses and they would be raised for the whole world to see. Those crosses outside of Jerusalem, a blunt reminder of the full weight of Rome's wrath. It was just another day, like so many before it, and no doubt, like so many that would come after it. The day was just another day, until a voice dripping with disdain and a spear aimed to kill says to a passerby, You carry his cross. The man, clearly from somewhere else, and his two little boys looked at the guard in utter shock. Frozen in time, thoughts racing through his head. Questions like, why me? What about my two boys? What if I refuse? Can I refuse? Reluctantly, yet under compulsion, the man picked up the cross and he carried it. He was thrown into a story that wasn't his own. And the weight of the wood, or maybe the weight of this burden, or the weight of being so close to a man who had been bloodied by whips and a crown of thorns, that weight was evidenced by the furrow of his brow. And as the man began to walk slowly and methodically to the place called the skull, it was obvious that the smell of dirt and sweat and blood were trespassing into the man's personal space. It was a stench that most, if not all, try to avoid. And as that man carried the cross, he strained to see the ground in front of him, all while making sure that his two boys were following closely, but not too closely. Again, thinking, what would they think of this day? What would they think of what their dad has to do? How would the events, the sights, and the smells affect their tender and small hearts? Clearly, this day was not just another day. The man from Cyrene labored beside the man who, while bloodied from the events of the morning, seemed to have a kind of determination in his eyes. His face was set toward the events now unfolding. And the man from Cyrene could hear the labored breaths of the man next to him. He could feel his own sweat roll over his face, and he could almost taste the blood that seemed to thicken the air. That man from Cyrene and the man bloodied by the events of the morning, they never exchanged words. But somehow the man from Cyrene seemed to understand that this bloodied and determined man, somehow he knew him. Somehow this bloodied man loved him. Somehow this bloodied man had compassion on him. That somehow this man, for whom he was carrying the cross, was bearing the weight of so much more. Well, they walked the route from the Antonin Fortress to Golgotha, what would later be called the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering. And they arrived where so many people had arrived before. And once arriving, the weight of the cross was removed from the Cyrenian's shoulder. And the man that he had walked with looked him in the eye with great love and great compassion, gave himself completely to the events that came next. He was laid on a cross. He was nailed to it. A sign was posted above his head, "King of the Jews." And then he was hoisted into the air, and the weight of his own body put an almost unbearable pressure on his lungs. And there he was, crucified between two others. One of them joining in the mockery of the crowd, and the other seemed, to care somehow. The man from Cyrene, Simon is his name, and his two boys, Alexander and Rufus, they stood hand in hand, captivated at the tragedy unfolding before them, like drivers who can't help but look at accidents along the road. And that father and his two sons were suddenly aware of the different groups of people. The women, there were lots of them weeping as they watched this man whom they clearly loved. There was the Jewish elite, who along with the crowds were taunting him and hurling insults at him like stones. "If you really are the Son of God," they said, "if you really are the Son of God, then come down." There were the Roman guards, who seemed troubled and yet dutiful. The passers-by, those coming and going from the city, trying to avoid that all too familiar scene. And yet the scene was different. This wasn't a common criminal. It wasn't a defiant insurrectionist like the man who had been released earlier that day. No, this was a man who was laboring to breathe. And who, while laboring to breathe, one could hear him say, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." And it makes one wonder, how could a man in that place and at that time utter such words? Like, how is it possible that he's uttering such forgiveness for the people who actually put him there? Pouring out such mercy on those who brought the weight of the hammer and a nail. Pouring out such love on people that he knew and people that he didn't. It makes one wonder if that's how he dies, then how did he live? Well, stories of healing, of chain breaking, of freedom bringing, of sin forgiving, all of that have circled this man for years. But as that father and two sons watched, they could see the weight of the inevitable being etched deeper and deeper into the cracks and the crevices of this man's face. The inevitable. Dust you are, and to dust you will return. See, death comes to all people. And between every labored breath, one could see that this man, this King of the Jews, knew that death was coming for him. At the height of the day, when the sun should have been its highest and its hottest, it somehow hid its face in sorrow. The darkness of that afternoon was thick, and it was heavy, the likes of which hadn't been seen since Israel was in Egypt. And there, for 3 hours, the world felt heavy, as if every grief and every sorrow and every injustice was somehow raining down on this man who simply hung. And in the hours of those dark minutes, the weight of every sad thing, the weight of every broken heart, the weight of every fractured relationship, it was crushing. It was crushing Jesus. You know, the prophets of old spoke of this moment. A moment when God would send a servant, a suffering servant, a servant who would stand under the judgment of God, pierced, stricken, smitten, afflicted, wounded, and crushed. The prophets of old have said that the Lord would lay upon him the iniquity of all people. You see, what began as one sin in Eden has become a world's worth of ruin. And there, under thick and heavy darkness, Jesus didn't move, not because he's weak, but because Jesus refuses to move, knowing that in this crushing, there will be healing and there will be life. And just then, when one thought it couldn't get any worse, Jesus spoke, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Embracing and embodying the lament of Psalm 22. Jesus is wondering why the Father is so far away, why the Father is deaf to the cries of his own Son, why the Father is so unwilling to lift the crushing weight of judgment. The questions are simple. God, where are you? Why will you not act? Why will you not intervene? God, why won't you answer me? Answer me. the weight that has followed us, that has followed you and me, the weight that has followed us from Eden now concentrates itself on the cross. Isaiah said, he has borne our griefs, he has carried our sorrows, and he was pierced for our transgressions, and he was crushed for our iniquities. Tonight, church, at the cross, there is no symbol or metaphor. There is only the Son of God absorbing the holy wrath that should have fallen on us, that should have fallen on you and on me. See, you and I are the ones who fail to love God with our whole heart. And we are the ones who fail to love our neighbors as much as we love ourselves. And yet it is Jesus who in love would endure the weight of God's judgment. And at the cross, nothing is held back. The full weight of God's judgment falls. And there, as the full weight of sin is absorbed by Jesus, as he endures the crushing of the Father's wrath, between every labored breath, Jesus would pray, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." It's almost unfathomable that even as Jesus is being crushed under the full weight of God's wrath, that somehow he would also entrust himself into the hands of his now silent Father. And yet he does. He does. He's resting in the promise that God would be his rescue, that wounds could be peace, that crushing could be healing, and that death could be life. And maybe this is why Jesus was so ready to proclaim Psalm 22. Yes, it begins in lament, but the psalm is pulsing with hope. Here again, those words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out to you by day, but you don't answer, by night, and I find no rest. And yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You inhabit the praises of Israel. In you, our ancestors put their trust. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried out, and they were saved. In you they trusted, and they were not put to shame. Between every labored breath, Jesus saying, you have saved your people once. Do it again. For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He's not hidden his face from the one who cried for help. See, friends, it is finished is not a cry of defeat, but it is a declaration that the entire weight of sin has been carried to completion. When you and I look at the cross, let us see there the weight of humanity's brokenness, the weight of our sin. As one hymn sings, it was our sin that held him there. When we look at the cross, let us see the weight of sin, but let us also see Jesus, who was willing to bear that weight to its utter completion for you and for me, for the whole world. It was supposed to be just another day. But there, outside the walls of Jerusalem, there, at the place of the skull, Jesus was hung on a cross until he breathed his last. And there the world stood in silence. The women, the crowds, the religious elite, the passersby. It was as if the whole world lost its breath. When the weight of the air feels heavy. Breaking that silence was a Roman guard who was to ensure that the man on the cross had died. And so he took that pointed spear and he pierced his side. And like the love and mercy that had flowed so freely from his prayers and his words, so did water and blood pooling on the ground there at the feet of Jesus. You know, songwriters years later describing that moment would sing, "Who would dare ascend that mountain, that valleyed hill called Calvary? But the one who calls, Good Shepherd, who like a lamb was slain for me." As the sun began to set, several people grew anxious to get Jesus off that cross and in a final resting place before the Sabbath began. There, as the sun was setting, a Pharisee named Nicodemus and another man, Joseph, was granted permission to retrieve the body of Jesus. And like Simon the Cyrene, who earlier that day had to bear the weight of the cross, now these two would bear the weight of a body without life, where the stench of dirt and sweat and blood would commingle, stinging their nose. And yet, Nicodemus and Joseph were undeterred. They were committed to bear this burden all the way to its completion, until Jesus was led to the borrowed tomb of Joseph. It would take several men to roll the stone into place. And with a loud thud, it was done. You know, Simon and his two boys, they would eventually head home. Their conversations along the way about the man who uttered such love and mercy in the midst of his dying would be crushed under the weight of it all. And yet that same man who would entrust himself to God, those conversations between father and sons would make their long journey short. I imagine that as Simon entered his home, Simon's wife, filled with the relief that her family had returned, simply asked, "How was your journey?" And Simon replying, "Oh, babe, it was, I don't know. I'd say I was thrust into the events of someone else's life, somehow denying my own way and picking up a cross to follow wherever he went. But honestly, I think this King of the Jews, this Jesus, and his dying and his praying and his loving, I don't know. I guess he was thrust into our lives. And it'll never be the same. This day is not just another day. It is a day when Jesus would be crushed for our iniquities. And you and I, friends, we will never be the same. To God be the glory. Amen.